I believe we got up through chapter 23 of Job last week. This is Job's response to misery. We're going through the dialogue. This will be the fourth part of the dialogue, and we're going up through Job's last speech in this class. Next week, we'll introduce a new character, the young man Elihu. Elihu has not appeared in the story so far. He's a young man that apparently is not satisfied with either Job or Job's friends, and so he's going to give it a try himself. We'll go through the discourses of Elihu next week, and then after that, the Sunday after that, December 20th, God finally gets a chance to talk, and we'll see what God has to say and resolve the story of Job on December 20th. I know I mention this every time, but I just want to give credit where credit is due. My expert witnesses here are two professors, Marvin H. Pope from Yale University, who wrote a book called Job, A New Translation with Introduction and Commentary, and Edward L. Greenstein. His book is Job, A New Translation. He teaches at, he's actually professor emeritus at Bar Ilan University in Israel. So I just want to give credit to the sources I'm taking my information from. Before I get into the text today, I believe it was Larry last time that asked a question about the different translations and how translations could be so different. I mentioned one thing, but I don't think I did a very good job of answering the question in general. So I'm going to start with that today. Just take a step back from Job and talk about Bible translations in general. One reason that translations can differ, there are many reasons why translations can differ. One is is physical. The manuscript might be, the ink might be faded. It might be smudged. Fragments could be missing, pages out of order, and so forth. Also, there are scribal issues. Scribes sometimes accidentally copied the same line twice, or completely dropped a line, or discovered that they had left something out and put it in wherever they happened to be at the time. So those things make it very hard to understand what's going on. There's also the language itself. I mentioned last time that ancient Hebrew doesn't have any vowels. You have to fill in the vowels yourself as you're reading. And depending on the vowels you fill in, the word might take on vastly different meanings. For instance, if you consider the English letters RT, well, depending on what vowel you use, that could be rat, rate, right, wrote, rot, root. So many possibilities for just a small word. Now, if a word had more than one syllable and more than one vowel, think about how the possibilities multiply in that case. Also, ancient Hebrew had no punctuation, and all the letters were run together. So when looking at a particular letter, the translators have to ask, okay, is this the ending letter of a word, or is it the first letter of the next word? And the lack of punctuation also makes quite a difference, quite a problem. I want to give you an example. This example is from the New Testament. New Testament Greek also had no punctuation and no spaces between words, right? They were all run together. Fortunately, New Testament Greek had vowels, unlike Hebrew. But let me see if I can share my screen here. I want to bring up a rather well-known example from 1 Corinthians. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 17, verse 21. Now, I'm going to start with a pretty much word for word literal translation from the Greek. Remember, no punctuation. A slave, when called, never mind, if you can gain your freedom, use it. Where do you put the punctuation there, and what does the word it refer to? I'll give you two examples, two real world examples. The Revised Standard Version of the Bible punctuates that Greek verse as follows. A slave, when called, never mind. If you can gain your freedom, use it. It referring to gain your freedom, which leads to the RSV translation. Were you a slave when called? Never mind. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity.
Wow.
Okay. Now, second example, the New Revised Standard Version. That's the version I use most of the time. This translator must have punctuated the Greek in the following way. A slave when called, never mind if you can gain your freedom, use it. It referring to the condition of being a slave, which leads to the NRSV translation. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. Almost the opposite, right? In one case,
Like that
try
last
to gain your freedom,
Right.
and in the second case, use your condition as a slave.
I
So
vote for
that's
the New Revised Standard Translation version, Steve. That's good.
pardon.
I vote for the New Revised Standard version. That's good. Really nice.
Actually, the consensus is, I've looked at the New International Version, the American Standard Version, the New King James Version, and the consensus seems to be that first one, the RSV. Even the scholar who wrote the notes in my NRSV study Bible says that it's wrong, right? Now, the majority isn't always right, but the NRSV translators went against common convention in the reference to the word it. If there's a question of what a pronoun points to, it's much more likely that it points to something that is close to the pronoun. In other words, gain your freedom is much more likely than stretching it all the way back to a slave, okay? So the consensus seems to be the first one, the Revised Standard Version, and the NRSV, well, it's a very good translation. In this case, it's probably a little misleading. Okay, so
that version would probably fit in with the civil rights era in the United States, actually.
yes, it probably would.
Could I add that that the Romans had a system where you could, if you were taken or as a slave or bought as a slave, you could usually buy yourself out after about 7 years. It was more like an indentured servitude, sort of.
Okay,
So that slavery was, it was definitely not racial. It was like anybody, you could sell your kids into slavery, okay,
yeah,
and
Yeah.
buy them back out.
yes,
And
or
if you, well, if
yeah.
you did it 3 times, the kid was allowed to go free. And if your father was, you know, if you and your dad weren't getting along and he sold you into slavery 3 times,
Poor kid,
after
huh?
that you were emancipated.
Oh
Feel
my
sorry for the kid.
Or as opposed to chattel slavery, which was much more heinous.
Yeah, the slaves in the field never got free.
Well, certainly the Southern slave owners used the biblical text to their advantage before 1860, that's for sure. So you have to be, this was really important passages from the Bible back then on
Yes.
both sides.
Yes, yeah. So that's my little digression into biblical translation and
Wow.
Another question?
maybe an explanation of why this is so complicated.
Another question? Was Job part of the Septuagint?
Yes,
Okay, so it got
Yes.
translated into Greek?
yeah, yeah, Job, that's one of the sources that the translators use is the Septuagint, the Greek translation. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Septuagint was the earliest known text of the Hebrew Bible. But of course, it was a translation from Hebrew to Greek with all of those problems that are involved with that. The earliest known Hebrew version was from the Masoretes in the time a few hundred years after Christ. So until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Greek translation was the oldest, far older than the oldest known Hebrew text at the time.
Was there
Okay.
something about, Steve, was there something about vowels for the Hebrews that they were so sacred that you can't pronounce them or write them or what?
No, I don't think so. I think the written form of Hebrew, started out as sort of a shorthand, right? And they would jot down the sounds, but just the consonant sounds. And when somebody was reading it, then that would be a reminder so that they wouldn't forget anything. But they were expected to know the story, right? The text was just to remind them so they wouldn't forget anything.
Wow.
The Egyptians didn't use vowels either, as far as I know.
Is that right? Yeah, I know nothing about Egyptians, so yeah. All right, thanks. Well, should we proceed into Job 24 then? Let's do that. It might be handy if you have your Bible nearby to open it up to Job 24 and follow along. I'll try not to read all of it, especially since I spent 15 minutes, 1/3 of our class time talking about Bible translation. I'm going to have to move pretty quickly through the rest of this. We're getting toward the end of our class series, so I've got to make some progress if we're going to get through all of this. Chapter 24, verse 1. Why are times not kept by the Almighty, and why do those who know him never see his days? This refers to God's judgment. Why are times of God's judgment not kept? So the Almighty, in other words, the Almighty knows what's going on. Where's the judgment is what Job is asking here. This is Job speaking here. Verse 2, the wicked remove landmarks. They seize flocks and pasture them. Landmarks refers to markers for property boundaries. So he's talking about the wicked who move property boundaries to their own advantage and take flocks and pasture them as their own. And a very, I'll skip down to verse 6 now. They reap in a field not their own, and they glean in the vineyard of the wicked. Well, he's talking about the wicked. So I think a better translation, at least according to Greenstein, is wealthy. They glean in the vineyard of the wealthy. Now, this next section can be very confusing. I hope I can clear this up. Job varies who he's talking about. Sometimes he's talking about the wicked. Sometimes he's talking about the victims of the wicked. And I'll point out which is which as we go through. First, verse 7, the victims. They lie all night naked without clothing and have no covering in the cold. They are wet with the rain of the mountains and cling to the rock for want of shelter. Now the wicked, verse 9. There are those who snatch the orphan child from the breast and take as a pledge the infant of the poor. Sort of talking about those who sell their children into slavery, I guess. Okay, now verse 10, switching back to victims. They go about naked without clothing. Though hungry, they carry the sheaves. Between their terraces, they press out oil, or alternatively, when olives drop, they press out oil. They tread the wine presses, but suffer thirst. From the city, the dying groan, and the throat of the wounded cries for help, yet God pays no attention to their prayer. So even though they are hungry and thirsty, they carry grain and tread wine for the wealthy, for the rich and the wicked. Now, verse 13, back to the wicked. There are those who rebel against the light, who are not acquainted with its ways and do not stay in its paths. The murderer rises at dusk to kill the poor and the needy, and in the night is like a thief. I think this line is misplaced. I'm going to move it somewhere else in a minute. Verse 15, the eye of the adulterer also waits for the twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he disguises his face. Now here I'm going to move that one line down because we're talking about thieves here. Like a thief in the night, in the dark, they dig through houses. By day, they shut themselves up. They do not know the light. Dig through houses. Remember, houses were made of clay bricks back then. So one way you can break in is by digging through the walls. Verse 17, for deep darkness is mourning to all of them, for they are friends with the terrors of deep darkness. I'm now going to skip down to verse 25. If it is not so, who will prove me a liar and show that there is nothing in what I say? I skipped verses 18 through 24 because they don't appear to be the words of Job. Job is claiming that the wicked are rewarded by God, and the innocent, like himself, those are the people who are punished by God. But in this section, there are words such as the womb forgets them, the worm finds them sweet. They are no longer remembered, so wickedness is broken like a tree. That sounds more like what one of Job's friends would say. So Greenstein calls this a secondary address to Job. It may be out of place. It may be part of some other discourse by one of Job's friends, for example. But I just point that out because you may get confused reading through this because these don't sound like Job's words, and maybe they're not. Chapter 25, now it's Bildad's turn to talk. Then Bildad, the Shuhite, answered, dominion and fear are with God. He makes peace in his high heaven. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not arise? Armies probably refers to the stars in the sky. Can you count the stars in the sky? So Bildad continues his discourse down through verse 6. Now, notice chapter 25 only has 6 verses in it. This is very unusual. Most of the discourses, all of the other discourses are much longer than that. So what's going on here? Starting with chapter 26, that begins, then Job answered, how have you helped one who has no power, and etc. The experts disagree here. What's going on? One thing to note is that in 26 verses 1 through 4, the words are all singular. Now, up to this point in time, when Job addresses his friends, he uses the plural because there's 3 of them, 3 friends, right? But, and then when a friend answers Job, he answers using the singular. Job is speaking here to his friend, maybe speaking to his friends, but the words are in the singular. How do we explain this? The experts differ. Some say, well, Job is not answering all of his friends, but specifically he's interrupting Bildad in Bildad's discourse. So that's why these words are in the singular. Now, Greenstein disagrees. He says, these aren't the words of Job, these are the words of Bildad. So chapters 25 and 26 make one complete discourse of Bildad. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to try to judge between two experts. So, but just keep that in mind when you're reading this. These words may be Bildad's, they may be Job's. For certain, Bildad continues starting with verse 5. The shades below tremble, the waters and their inhabitants. Shades are the souls in the afterlife, down in Sheol. This could be translated, the shades tremble below the waters and their inhabitants, which implies that Sheol is even farther down than the ocean. Verse 6, Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering. Abaddon is a synonym for Sheol. Both of those words refer to the afterlife. Verse 7, he stretches out Zaphon over the void and hangs the earth upon nothing. Zaphon is a mountain that was considered to be sort of the Mount Olympus of Canaanite mythology. It was the dwelling of the Canaanite gods. Verse 8, he binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not torn open by them. I will jump down to verse 12 in the interest of time. By his power he stilled the sea, by his understanding he struck down Rahab. Rahab is one of the words describing the monster of chaos that was imprisoned in the sea by God during creation. By his hand the heavens were made fair, his hand pierced the fleeing serpent, again a reference to the monster of chaos. Then in verse 14, these are indeed but the outskirts of his ways. In other words, this is just the tip of the iceberg, guys, right? That's what he's saying here. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Now in chapter 27, now Job takes up his discourse again. Job again took up his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter. And he complains about his what is happening to him. But he says in verse 6, though I hold fast my righteousness and I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. So he doesn't feel guilty for anything he's done. He feels that he has held on to righteousness. Now, another problem section, starting with verse 7. Again, more than one opinion by the experts. This doesn't sound like, these words from verse 7 to the end of the chapter don't sound like the words of Job again. So two explanations. One is that Job is being sarcastic by sarcastically repeating what his friends have said. Right? That's one explanation. There is at least one commentator that I have read that feels that this may be the so-called lost discourse of Zophar. You see, there are 3 cycles of discourses in this poetic section between Job and his friends. Each cycle goes Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar. At least the first 2 cycles do. We're in the 3rd cycle now. Zophar doesn't appear. Either Zohar didn't speak in this cycle, or his discourse was dropped out somehow, somewhere along the way. So that's those are the 2 possibilities here. Either this is Job being sarcastically repeating the words of his friends, or this may be the lost 3rd discourse of Zophar. Verse 7, may my enemy be like the wicked, and may my opponent be like the unrighteous. So may God do away with him. Down to verse 12, all of you have seen it yourselves. Why then have you become altogether vain? The Hebrew words more literally are, why are you still breathing, windy speech. Right? More talk about breathing and the wind and vanity. Verse 18, they're talking about the wicked still. They build their houses like nests, like booths made by sentinels of the vineyard. I want to talk a little bit about that. In the Hebrew, it is probably they build their houses like spiders. In other words, like a web, which means delicate, easy to knock down. That's emphasized by booths made by the watchmen of the vineyard. The watchmen of the vineyard would build little shacks for themselves for shelter when they were keeping watch over the vineyard. These booths were temporary and easy to knock down. So their houses are easy to knock down. Verse 21, the east wind lifts them up and they are gone. It sweeps them out of their place. It hurls at them without pity. They flee from its power in headlong flight. Now, the word it could also be translated he. I don't know if any of you are familiar with languages where everything has a gender. French and Spanish are like that. The words, every word has a gender. And so there's a problem translating that into English where we don't have that, because the word he could be translated also it, and the word she as it. And we have that in this place here. Verse 22 may be talking about God rather than the east wind. God hurls at them without pity. They flee from his power in headlong flight. So that's another possibility. Verse 23, it claps its hands, or people clap their hands at them and hiss at them from their place. Clapping and hissing are derogatory demonstrations. Okay, chapter 28. Chapter 28 is an odd one, so I'm going to go through it very fast. This doesn't seem to be a part of the book at all. It's an example of wisdom literature that some editor has placed in here. This talks about wisdom. It's more like Proverbs than the rest of the book of Job, right? So I'll go through it very quick. Greenstein in his book doesn't cover it all. He thinks it doesn't belong here, and maybe he's right. But I'll cover it very quickly. So the first part of chapter 28 talks about how people are very good at digging mines to extract precious metals and gemstones. People are through a lot of work, even though in verse 7, that path no bird of prey knows and the falcon's eye has not seen it. So animals don't do that, but people using their intelligence and hard work are very good at extracting these expensive things from the ground. But what about wisdom? Where do you go to find wisdom? He's contrasting here precious metals and gemstones with wisdom, both in terms of where they're found and also their worth. In verse 17, gold and glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. Verse 20 repeats the questions of verse 12. Where then does wisdom come from, and where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and Death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. So even the most desolate, remote, and inaccessible places, Abaddon and Death say, well, it's not here. And then verse 23, God understands the way to it, and he knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he gave to the wind its weight and apportioned out the waters by measure, when he made a decree for the rain and a way for the thunderbolt, then he saw it and declared it. He established it and searched it out. And he said to humankind, truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So, like I said, it sounds a lot more like Proverbs than Job. Chapter 29. Now we're into the very long final speech of Job, 3 chapters long. As I mentioned in my outline, in chapter 29, Job longs for the life he once had. In chapter 30, Job laments his present condition. And in chapter 31, he passionately asserts his innocence. So we can go through this quickly. We don't have a lot of time left, but we'll see what we can do. Chapter 29, Job again took up his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me." And he's talking about how those days were. Verse 6, when my steps were washed with milk and the rock poured out for me streams of oil. The rock may be a way of referring to God. God poured out for me streams of oil. Now, verse 7 is very interesting, and I'll tell you why. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, now at last we find out what Job's profession was before he was afflicted. He was a judge. The gate of the city is where justice was done, where the judges sat. So when I took my seat in the square, when he went out to the gate to do his job as a judge. Verse 8, the young men saw me and withdrew. The aged rose up and stood out of respect. The nobles refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouths, not to keep themselves from talking, but maybe pondering, intensely pondering what this honorable judge had to say. When the ear heard, it commended me. When the eye saw, it approved, because I delivered the poor who cried and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the wretched came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. So he's telling here about all of the good things he did as a judge for the people. Jumping to verse 18, then I thought, I shall die in my nest. What is implied here is nest of fledglings. In other words, he said, I'll die with my family surrounding me. And of course, we know that his children were killed early on in this story. And I shall multiply my days like the phoenix, or like the sand, like grain. My days will be like the grains of sand. Verse 24, it may be confusing. I'm skipping the verses that seem to be obvious here. Verse 24, I smiled on them when they had no confidence, and the light of my countenance they did not extinguish. A little confusing. For extinguish, literally it's cause it to fall down. That's not much clearer, but one thing to remember is think about the prophets that prayed to God, do not let my words fall to the ground. What that means is if an archer shoots an arrow and the arrow misses its target, it falls to the ground. So by saying, do not let my words fall to the ground, he's saying, let my words hit their target. Let them be effective. And that may be the case here. The light of my countenance, they did not cause to fall to the ground or to fall down. So that may be what it's referring to here, that it be effective. Chapter 2, I'm getting an occasional message that my internet connection is unstable. I've got the computer in a slightly different spot in the room than I have in the past weeks, so I hope that this gets through all right. Verse 25, I chose their way. This is talking about the people that he guided. I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. According to Greenstein, that last line doesn't make any sense with the rest of it. It doesn't agree with the context. If you revocalize the words of that, in other words, try different vowels, it could read, wherever I lead them, they camp. That fits in with the leader of the army, making the verse read, I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops. Wherever I'd lead them, they'd camp. So that may be a more correct translation. That's by virtue of revocalization, inserting different vowels. Okay. Now, chapter 30, he's going to lament his current condition. But now they make sport of me, those who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. Ouch. That's pretty cold. And then he disparages them even further. Verse 3, through want and hard hunger, they gnaw the dry and desolate ground. They pick mallow and the leaves of bushes, and to warm themselves, the roots of broom. There's a bush called a broom bush. These, again, this might be more faithfully translated in terms of food. Pick mallow from the bushes. That mallow evidently was very unpleasant to eat. It was gelatinous and slimy. And so they're probably talking about, he's probably talking about eating here. They pick mallow in the leaves of the bushes and leaves of bushes, and for food, the roots of broom. Nomads were sometimes in hard times known to eat the root of the broom bush. Very unpleasant, but it kept them alive. They're driven out from society. People shout after them as after a thief. Verse 6, in the gullies of wadis they must live, in holes of the ground and in the rocks. Wadis are streams that dry up in warm weather, so they're unreliable. So he's saying here, these people live in dried up stream beds and in caves. Among the bushes they bray, under the nettles they huddle together. A senseless, disreputable brood, they have been whipped out of the land. In other words, expelled from the land. Verse 9, and now they mock me in song. I read a more creative translation, which reads, I am the butt of their jingles. I thought that was a good translation. Verse 11, because God has loosed my bowstring. In other words, you can't fire an arrow with a loose bowstring. So Job is being left defenseless, he says. Loosen my bowstring and humble me. They have cast off restraint in my presence. Again, the Hebrew is a little bit more colorful. They have thrown off the bit, comparing them with an animal with a bit in its mouth. They have thrown off the bit, cast off restraint. On my right hand, the rabble rise up. They send me sprawling and build roads for my ruin. Verse 14, as through a wide breach they come, amid the crash they roll on. The metaphor here is with a broken dam. When a dam breaks and the water crashes through it. Terrors are turned upon me and my honor is pursued as by the wind, or blown away by the wind. And my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. Could be prestige. He's talking about honor in the previous line, so prestige might be better than prosperity in this line. All right. How are we doing for time? I need to hurry up. Then he talks about his affliction that racks his bones. Verse 18, again, we have a choice between he or it. With violence, he seizes my garments. Or if he's talking about his disease, he's talking about either God or his disease. With violence, it seizes my garment. It grasps me like the collar of my tunic. In other words, around the neck. He has cast me into the mire and I have become like dust and ashes, or it has cast me into the mire. I cry to you and you do not answer me. I stand and you merely look at me. He says in verse 22, you lift me up on the wind That is to be carried away. And this is not intended to be a good thing. He's going to be carried away by the wind. Just to comment on verses 24 and 25. These sound like they belong in the next chapter, chapter 31, because he is defending, now he's defending himself for 2 verses. Well, that's all of what he does in chapter 31. So maybe these 2 verses are out of place. Maybe Job is so distraught that his thinking is not linear. Let me skip up to chapter 31 now. Now he's going to defend himself. He's going to go through all the list of possible sins for which he deserves this punishment. So chapter 31, verse 1, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look upon a virgin? So he says, I've never looked on a woman with lust. Verse 5, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. Down in verse 9, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, this would be a married woman. This is about adultery. If my heart has been enticed by a married woman and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, waiting for his neighbor's wife, you see, then let my wife grind for another and let other men kneel over her. So he's saying, if I have committed adultery, let my wife be unfaithful. 13. There's an interesting verse here, 13 through 15. If I have rejected the cause of my male or female slaves when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? In other words, rises up to judge. When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb, fashion us the same in the womb? I think this is a very interesting verse, because here is a testament to equity, right? Job is saying, we're all made in the same way. Let's see, what we're getting toward the end of our time. What do I want to talk about here? Verse 19, if I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or perishing for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, whose loins have not blessed me and who was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep. So he's talking about people who who are perishing for freezing to death. He has always helped them. If I have raised my hand against the orphan because I saw I had supporters at the gate. Remember what at the gate means, right? If his fellow judges would let him get away with it, is what he's saying. Even if my fellow judges would let me get away with it, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder and let my arm be broken from the socket. A verse that needs more explanation, 26. If I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed and my mouth has kissed my hand. This refers to pagan worship, worshiping the sun and the moon. And kissing the hand is a symbol of adoration. So he said, if I have engaged in pagan worship, this also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I should have been false to God above. So he's also claiming that he's never engaged in pagan worship. Verse 31, if those of my tent, that is his town, if those of my town ever said, oh, that we might be sated with his flesh, that means defaming him or calling him derogatory names. The stranger has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. This is about hospitality. You might think, well, what does bad hospitality have to do with such a severe punishment? In that society, hospitality was extremely important in that desert society. If there was a traveler who arrived in your town, you had a duty from God to take care of that person, to welcome that person. 33, if I have concealed my transgressions as others do, literally as Adam did. Remember how Adam tried to hide his transgression from God? That's what Job is referring to here. By hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I stood in great fear of the multitude. That's a town mob. Verse 35, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here's my signature, or literally, here's my mark. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. So he's asking again for God to tell him what the charges are. 38, if my land has cried out against me and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment and caused the death of its owners, let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. The word, and there's an extra verse line here. The words of Job are ended. This is the end of Job's long speech. There may be a little play on words. In Hebrew, the word for ended has the same root as integrity or blameless. So this may imply through wordplay, the words of Job are blameless.
Steve,
Yes,
can I make one comment, quick comment?
of course.
I don't know if you've heard of William Blake, the mystic
Yes,
poet.
of
He
course.
did a whole set of wood carvings on the book of Job. And he pointed to these passages that you just covered this morning as evidence of Job's pride. And that was why he was suffering.
Oh,
That
interesting.
was William Blake's The Mystic Artist interpretation.
Okay,
Just sharing that.
yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I have a message here. All breakout rooms will close in 20 seconds. So does anybody have a 20-second comment? Larry, you're muted.
This could be a year-long course.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
How long do we go? How long do you go, Steve?
Last class is December 20th, 2 weeks from today.